One of the limitations in Jaguars that use this type of audio system, so the XJ X350, X350, X-Type and S-Type, is that there's no easy way to get an audio auxiliary input into the system. There are a couple of ways around it, which is, for example, you can use an FM transmitter where you tune in the radio to a specific frequency that the transmitter transmits on, and it plays it as if it was a radio station, but the quality of that isn't particularly very good. And there's also another unit that's been available for a little while now, but it's been developed by a guy called Venelin Efremov on the Jaguar forums, which replaces the CD changer, and it lets you stream via Bluetooth from any modern phone, which is a proper neat way to do it, but it is relatively expensive. But I've discovered that there is a way to actually perform this mod on the CD player, but only on certain models of the CD player. Some people have reported that it doesn't actually work because there are some variants of this which it would appear have a fully digital transport internally, whereas these particular version that I've got here uses an analog transport between the CD transport mechanism and the audio amplifier system. So this particular model, the first two parts of the part code are always the same. The last two digits designate the revision. So I know for a fact that it works on BM because I've done that on an existing BM. Somebody else has already reported that it works on a BK version as well. So I'd be interested to know of any part codes of any newer versions where it doesn't work. Because it would be quite good to have a digital auxiliary in on some of the units, so that from the Odroid, for example, you can connect the SP diff directly into the system rather than having to go through a digital to analog converter. But anyway, I'll show you how to modify the system to give you an auxiliary analog input, which I'll perform on this one right now. So if we look at the back of the unit, the first thing you need to do is take out these 3 screws which secure the top cover. That will reveal all the innards, which will let us connect up to the analog input. You can actually do the same mod, or a very, very similar mod, on the cassette player, but I found that the quality on the cassette player isn't quite as good as the CD player. There could be various reasons for that, but I found that the CD player is actually a neater, nicer solution because you don't have to put a dummy cassette in. And it works better if you're using the track skipping function integrated with the Odroid, which I'll talk about later on. You can't do that on the cassette player because it mutes whenever you're trying to fast forward or rewind. So anyway, using a screwdriver, you basically need to just prise up the top case. It's quite a firm fit because it forms part of the shielding. So once you take the top cover off, that will reveal the CD mechanism, which is attached by 4 screws, which we need to remove as the next step. So there's 4 screws here, which we need to remove. They are the same thread and the same type as the 3 screws that we just removed the lid. It's handy if you've got a magnetic screwdriver because they're quite recessed, otherwise it's very difficult to get them out. Got one stuck in here. There we go. Oops. Save that for later. Right, so that releases the CD mechanism, so you can carefully lift this up, and you'll see it's attached by a ribbon cable to the main board here. Now to release this, there's a tab on either side, so if you just push the 2 tabs away, and then the ribbon cable pulls out, and you can just put the CD transport to one side for now. We'll use that shortly. Now, interestingly, this is the same board that's in the cassette player. The cassette player, obviously, it's a completely different transport mechanism, but it uses a header connector on these sets of pins here. But what is quite handy is that the same analog left and right audio input pins are exactly the same on this particular model as the tape player. As I said earlier, I think later versions must use a different PCB revision, a different transport system for the audio. But luckily on this version we can actually inject our own audio into the audio that would be coming from the CD transport. So we need to cut the 2 tracks on the CD transport unit to stop the CD audio getting as far as this board, and then we'll inject our own audio on here. There's also another mod which I'll talk about later, which if you're using the Odroid system, you can take a couple of connections off here, which will tap into the resistor ladder network, which means that the steering control buttons for track skip forward and backwards can be used to trigger track skipping on the Odroid if you're using Spotify or a media player or anything like that. So that's a handy function. And then in addition to that, as part of the same mod, there's another pin on here which gives a logic level change when the CD is playing and when it's not playing. So we can use that so that the track skipping for the Odroid only works when the CD transport is actually playing. It saves you skipping tracks when it's on the FM station, for example. You don't want your Odroid to be skipping tracks in the background. So I'll show you the pins that we need to solder onto. So what I did is I ordered a cheap 3.5mm jack socket to, I think it's a pair of phono plugs cable from a seller on eBay, just really to get hold of the flying lead end with a 3.5mm stereo jack socket, which I'll use for my aux-in. So I'll have a flying lead on the back, and these will get soldered onto the 2 audio pins in the unit here. Now what we've got here, this board is identical with the cassette unit. Obviously the firmware in there must be different. Physically it's the same, but on the cassette player where the transport unit goes, there's actually a header pin arrangement soldered in here, which actually just replicate the ribbon cable here, which in the CD player's case go to the CD transport. So on this header, what we need is pin 1's on the very right hand side. We start at pin 3 is ground, pin 4 is left audio, and pin 5 is right audio. So using that we can solder our cable onto the pin header here, and then the first stage is as simple as that. So I'll do that now. So the easiest way to do this is, first of all, is just tin the connections here, which just makes it much easier to solder onto. So just apply the iron, a little bit of solder, and that's it. So there's three pads soldered. So somehow this is a sort of cable that comes with a figure 8, so they're both separated. Some of the cheaper ones are one thin fully enclosed piece of wire, but this one I'll split into 2 and go through to 2 of these handily placed ventilation holes on the back here. So just feed those through there. And then what I'll end up doing is just cable tying that to the back, and that will give me just a little tail on the back to plug into. So with the two screens, so the 2 ground connections here, they can actually be joined together. So what I'll probably end up doing on here is put a bit of heat shrink around them just to keep them together. So I can actually twist those together. They're both common together in the connection anyway. Let me find a bit of heat shrink. I should have some around here somewhere of a suitable size. Just needs to be large enough just to cover the screen to make sure that it doesn't short out onto anything else. Let's have a go at that. So that should a little bit too long. Just trim that down. There we go, that'll do nicely. I've got one of these fancy heat guns, which is quite good for heating heat shrink. You can use a gas lighter, or you can bodge it with a soldering iron if you really want to, but I've never really been a fan of that method. But that works nicely. So I've already pre-tinned these connections here as well. Let's just do it again, just to top it up a little bit. So let's just apply the iron and the solder just to the very end. Just put some fresh solder on there, just to make it easier to solder onto the pads. There we go. So I'll start off by just soldering the ground connection onto pad number 3. Oops. Need to make sure you apply enough heat that it actually flows onto the pad underneath as well. It's a little bit fiddly, it's fair to say. Probably should push a little bit more wire through there. And then we've got the right audio channel, which is red on pin 4, pad 4. And then finally we have other on pad 5. So there we go. So they're all nicely soldered. So what we need to do straight away pretty much is add some strain relief so that it doesn't end up pulling those wires out. So I'm just going to pass a cable tie through 2 of these holes. Just through that one, through that one. Make sure there's a little bit of slack on there so it's not tensioning that in any way. And then pull that tight. There's a nice bit of strain relief there. And there we go. So there's the auxiliary input there, soldered onto the 3 pins there. It's not the neatest job in the world, but it should do the job. The second part of this mod you have to do to the CD transport itself, which we removed earlier on. I've disconnected the ribbon cable here in the same way I did with the main board, because there are 2 tracks that you need to cut, which are actually underneath the ribbon cable here. So you can see screen printed, you've got right channel, left channel. So they're the 2 analog audio outputs from the CD transport that would normally go down the ribbon cable onto those 2 pads that we've soldered onto. So what you have to do to isolate the CD audio from going through to the amplifier is you just need to cut these 2 tracks. You can probably just see there I've cut the 2 tracks right near these through holes here. Just using a Stanley knife you can cut say 1 millimetre or so of track and just lift that out of the way just to make sure that the signal's broken. If you did want to reverse the mod at a later date, you could bridge those with a bit of solder or a little bit of wire or something like that, if you wanted to do that. One thing I did consider doing is adding a relay or other sort of mechanism so that you can switch between the CD audio and your external audio input. But to be honest, I never use CDs, so it's of no value to me. But you know, you could do that without too much trouble at all. Now, if all you want to do is have your aux in, then you're pretty much done. Just put the ribbon cable back and put everything back together. But I'm going to do the additional mod, which lets us use the steering wheel controls to do the skip track forward and skip track backwards functions. So there's 2 additional pins which we need to solder into the CD player, so I'll show you that now. So if you want to carry out the second part of the mod, which lets you use your steering wheel controls to control the track skipping forward and backwards on the Odroid, what you need is a piece of 2-core cable like this. I've just used some individual cable, twist it together, put a little 2-pin header, the type that you get with the Arduinos when you buy those, just with a little bit of heat shrink over the end. And then one needs to be slightly longer than the other, and I've cut and tinned the ends of the wires already. There's one connection needs to be made on the back of this multi-pin input connector, which is the resistor ladder input, and then there's another pin which is actually the 3rd one in from the left hand side here, which is the CD playing flag that tells you when the CD transport is actually playing a CD or not. So to start off, I find it's actually easier to solder on the back of this connector by removing it. It plugs into the board, so you can unscrew. There's one screw securing it just to the left of the input here, and then on the right hand side on this heatsink type arrangement there's another longer screw here. So if you just remove those 2 screws, and then the whole board just unplugs upwards, so just lift it upwards and it comes out that way. So you can actually see, hopefully on here, everything's helpfully screen printed, so you can see all the designations of the different pins here. But there's one down here which is marked remote con, which is our remote control, which is our steering wheel input. So we need to solder one of our wires, our longer wire, onto here. Before we do that, of course, we need to feed it back through the hole. So let's just pick another suitable hole, and then, as we did before, we'll get some solder and we'll just tin the pin, which will make it easier to attach our new cable. So we're on the remote con pin, and I'll use my longer wire here, which I'm using the brown one for that. No particular reason why, but that's what I'm using, and then solder that onto there. Boom, job's a good one. So that's nice. So that can plug back in. You might be able to solder it on without unplugging it, but it just makes it a little bit easier, I think, to get access if you take the connector out. So just remember to re-secure the socket in place. So there we go, that's nice and secure. So next we need to make the other connection for the CD playing flag, which I call it. So as I said before, it's the third one in from the opposite side to all the analog inputs. So I'm going to just tin that again. Make sure there's a nice bit of solder on there, something to attach to. Then our yellow one this time, I'll just trim it slightly shorter than that. Doesn't need to be very long at all, just long enough really to solder onto that pin. Oops. There we go. That's nice and secure onto that pad there. And then, as we did before, using a cable tie, just make sure we've got enough slack on there. That can just sit down below the transport system, and we'll use cable tie in the same manner. Just in one hole, out the other. And secure that nice and tight, just so it doesn't get pulled while we're doing the installation, because that would be bad. There we go. Let's trim the end off. So there we go, modded CD player. So we've got our auxiliary analog input on a 3.5mm stereo jack. We've got our resistor ladder input on the brown wire, which goes to the input socket here. We've got our CD playing yes or no flag on the yellow wire here, which will plug into the Arduino, into the analog inputs. So all we need to do now is do the reassembly. Right, so we're back in the car. Saying before, we can actually test the CD player without the touchscreen head unit in place. All we need to do is connect the D2B fibre connection and just the input connector, the CD player. There we go. If we then switch the ignition on, obviously can't really see what's going on here, but if you hold fast forward, AMM and PTY, that's the three-fingered salute, that should get us past the code. You can just test now. If you go into AM/FM, turn the volume up a bit. You can hear the noise in the background. Got no aerial connected, which is fine. Just stick in any old CD, will be fine. And then I'm using my phone. I'm playing. Where am I playing? Let me check if I'm playing. Yeah, I'm playing. So I'll just plug that into the new aux input on the back, if I can find it. It's a little 3.5mm tail. There we go. And then should be able to switch to CD mode. There we go. Bit of Al Stewart. So that's working. Obviously I can't test the track skipping functions until I get the Odroid and everything back into the car, but I'm going to assume for the time being that that's all working, so job's a good one.